What's going on? My name is Joe Lewis. I practice talking on the internet, and I hope you're having a good weekend or week or day, wherever day you find this video. I'd like to thank everybody who supports me over at Patreon, and that's the only sponsor of this type of content. And you can be one of the contributors too. For $5, $7, or $10, you get yourself a commission video and a bunch of other stuff. How many commission videos do you want? It depends on your tier. And as you get higher up on the tier, you could get a different number of commissions. So that is something, if that interests you, you can go do. And I'd also like to thank Jane, Marking, Maru, Fracco, Liberation, Valentine, and Michael for their contributions to the community and this thing we're trying to build here. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. Now, a lot of times I go on panels and I go into discussions. I feel like people don't understand what I'm saying when I say things, and sometimes it can be sort of harmless in the confines of the discussion or pretty brutal. So I kind of want to set a few things aside. So for those of you who see me, if I end up on a panel or I end up in a quote unquote debate, what you kind of can expect from me. So this is kind of like a living document, not really a living document, but at the point of March 11th, where these are kind of the things on my mind and how I approach conversations. And the first thing is I don't like debates. I think that debates, especially in the online spaces, they have a level of value, but for me, I'm disinterested in sort of the popular ideas that exist in debate discussions. One of them being just going in there, and by virtue of you existing within the debate, it's preventing the space from being an echo chamber of ideas or whatever. And it's like, I hate to break it to you, but those spaces are already echo chambers, because even by you entering to that conversation, especially if you're dealing with conservatives and liberals, the core of how they move and navigate is to be antagonistic to outgroups. So I think it's just incompatible to think that, oh, by virtue of me coming in that way, it's not going to be an echo chamber. And it's like, I hate to break it to you, buddy, but like, it's their job to go and fight you. So have fun dealing with that echo chamber. Again, like liberals and conservatives, their ideology requires opposition. So by going into that space, it's like you're not creating a non-echo chamber by virtue of you existing. That's just your ego. And another thing that I'm kind of disinterested about in like the sort of like contemporary, when I say contemporary, I mean like on the internet, idea of debates where you can just like change somebody's mind by virtue of you being on that panel, and then maybe like you'll bring some people over to your side and you can go fucking kick rocks with that bullshit. Again, like, I think generally speaking, people's desire, their appeals to internet debate as we currently see it is just a way of feeding ego. Debate has value, but not in the way that it exists on panels and places that you might see me or other individuals that are in the same sort of like circle, give or take. That's quote unquote Twitch politics, whatever the fuck. So I approach it a little bit differently. I just want to personally get a better understanding of what people say when they say things. This is the same with how I navigate online. I think sometimes a few things are happening in discussions. I think sometimes people don't really understand when their words betray them as they're talking. And I also think that people might feel like they need to ascribe to a certain idea or a certain level of navigation for niceties. So like when I'm in conversations, I'm trying my best to actually have them to the best of their ability, be honest in what they're saying and reveal what they say and feel. So that's kind of like how I move in conversations. So I'm not interested in people and like wanting to look optically good or correct or based. It's just I want to like it's selfish and personal for me, where I just want to understand better what people are saying when they say things, because a lot of times people are fucking confused, and I think when people are confused, especially in this online space, where I think people haven't really thought past a discussion or topic or even the very things they come on, in a way that, like, I just lost my train of thought. Basically, I think people don't really do, or like underdeveloped when it comes to certain ideas and stuff like that. So like when they run into people who have like a developed understanding of something, they get confused and then they start just kind of lashing out. So what I try to do, what I'm trying to do more actively and more like consciously, is just like, I'm not trying to get you in a dunking contest. I'm not trying to make you look stupid. You can just do that on your own self. I just want to know what you're saying when you say things. But what I'm noticing is that people, because of the confines of discussion, might not understand what I'm saying when I say certain things. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about a few things that I say that people I tell are not getting what I'm saying, especially in how they respond. So the first thing, to get it kind of out of the way, is, for me, I'm gonna say a lot of this, but for me, institutions are not the object. Institutions aren't the physical buildings that we have. Like, I think all of that got us all fucked up a bit. I believe institutions to be the settled habits of thought and action around these particular objects. And every time I say settled habits of thought and action, I can tell I'm losing people in real time. I don't give a shit anymore, but I'm like, clearly I give a little bit of a shit if I'm like doing a video about it. But let's just kind of break that down for a second. Settled habits of thought and action is merely the idea of X going to Y. So here's a simple settled habit of thought and action around an object. So the object is a traffic light. If the traffic light is red, the settled habit of thought, the action is stopping. So if the light is red, then you stop. Settled habit of thought, if the light is red, action, you stop. You need both of those things happen within institutions, and they're just collections of that. Now, the problem that currently exists with habits of thought and action is that they can fall into a couple of different categories. And I want to take a second to talk a little bit about those categories and those collections and what that looks like. So the first one that we have are conventions. And those are just, try to be as simple as I can as I say this. Conventions are a collection of unreflective habits of thought and action that are passed down from generation to generation. I'm probably going to say that a lot. Basically, what that means is you do something without really thinking about it. So when you see somebody, you nod to them. When you see somebody walking to you in public, you wave. And then if you interrogate, well, why do I do these things? That's where a sort of investigation comes into play. And we'll talk about investigations later. So an idea of a convention is that saying please and thank you before you even know why those words please and thank you are things and why they exist. The next one we have are traditions. Traditions are a little bit better than conventions because traditions are reflective habits of thought and action that are passed down from generation to generation. But yeah, so an example of a tradition is when something like, I'm trying to think of a really good example of a tradition. But we'll get to, maybe we don't actually, yeah, we need an example, right? So a tradition could be the bride wears white to a wedding, and bridal and non-bridal and bridal guests, excuse me, don't wear whites, especially for a woman. That's a tradition. um Another type of collection of habits of thought and action are science. Science is a collection of testable habits of thought and action that are passed down from generation to generation. So an example of science is like theories and even whole ass, like just whole, like, and there's and science is very, very broad because there's a bunch of different sciences that exist within the within science, and we'll get to those sort of limitations. But generally speaking, for the sake of this conversation or this little video, is that science are a collection of testable habits of thought and action that are passed down generation to generation. Then you have laws. And laws are a collection of legal habits of thought and action that are passed down from generation to generation. I don't need or think we need to do an example of what a law is. But yeah, so those are like kind of like the four that are pretty straightforward, I think, for people to kind of like think about and reflect upon and understand, and how they navigate in like the world around us. But here's the problem. You can't appeal to the mode of knowledge that I mentioned. So like all those things, conventions, traditions, sciences, laws, they're all modes of knowledge and collections of settled habits of thought and action, but they can't appeal to themselves to reveal it to be good, bad, true, or false. Because all of them have like these like what we'll call like presumptions or presumptions. I think that's the word. Anyway, I went to school for music. I'm sorry. So like, let's kind of break that down a little bit. Okay. So they all are, I realized what I was going to say. I'm so sorry about that. But sometimes when I have like a talk, I don't script these things. So I try my best to be clear on one shot. And sometimes my brain is like spaghetti, like right now. So I'm sorry about that. Like basically all these modes of knowledge, traditions, conventions, science, and law, all are unreliable in a few different ways. Conventions are unreliable because they are unreflective. They don't have any type of reflection to infer if it is good, if it is bad, if it is right, or if it is wrong. Traditions are slightly better than conventions because they admit reflection, but it can appeal to really bad foundations. I'll give you an example. We could have a long-standing tradition that you ought to, every time you see your partner, you slap them on the butt. Pop! And then the question is, why is this good? Well, it's good because we've always done it. That's not an answer. It's like, well, why is it bad? It's like, well, that's how we've always done it. That's also not an answer. It's not an answer to prove to itself that it is correct or it is incorrect. And that's the problem with all of these things. They're unreliable in different ways as the singular mode of knowledge that you navigate around. An example of that in science is a little bit tricky, where science is at the whim of the content of its analysis and then the relationship between the knowledge that currently exists and the object. So what that looks like is, how do we know that there are there's so many examples of this, but basically why is it that, like, why are there are there more only two genders? That was an example I gave on a panel a couple days ago. Like, if we use science to appeal to the idea that there are only two genders, science by its design is unreliable because it's going to both sides every issue, because they are testable habits of thought and action. So you can create a content of an analysis that does not investigate beyond the gender binary. So it might come to the conclusion that, based on the content of its analysis, that there are more than two genders. But then it could also, by basis of its content of analysis, say that there's only two, because how it interprets neither matters. How it interprets, how does it interpret two gender? How does it interpret somebody who there's so many problems, but there's so many problems with that. But basically, you have the content of the analysis, and then the knowledge of the knowledge that currently exists, and the object itself. So basically, what that looks like is, in terms of knowledge and its object, if we use, for instance, a basketball, and we say that, this basketball is used for kicking. And if we don't have any frame of reference, knowledge of what a basketball is, you could use science to come to the conclusion that the best way to shoot a basketball is by kicking it. It could also come to the conclusion that a basketball hoop is too high based on the content of the analysis. So based on the test of kicking, the content of the analysis, and there's no frame of reference for basketball, of what a basketball is, the knowledge and the relationship between knowledge and the object, you could come to the conclusion using science that the most optimal way of playing basketball is with your feet instead of your hands. But it can also come to the conclusion through science that the best way to play basketball is actually by hands and face. So science has this both sides problem, and I hope I'm explaining this properly, but it has this both sides and multiple sides problem, where because it's tested set of habits of thought and action, you're at the whim of the content of the analysis. So an example of content analysis is the scientific method or Socratic method. And then the relationship between the knowledge, so everything that currently exists, and the object. So you can't, if there's no frame of reference in science for Black people, then you can't appeal to science to say that Black people are humans. Because if there's no knowledge about Black people existing, you could use science to come to the conclusion that Black people aren't humans. Because there's no frame of reference, there's no knowledge around that. Laws are unreliable because they're contextually specific, and so what that means is something can be permissible in one context but then impermissible in another. An easy way of this is smoking, where you can smoke in your house, but you can smoke outside, but then you can't smoke inside of a restaurant. And it's well, why can't I smoke inside of a restaurant? And it's well, it's illegal. And it's okay, why is it illegal? Well, it's illegal because it's the law. Okay, but it was allowed a couple weeks ago. So why is it illegal now? Oh, the law's changed. Okay. A good example of this that a bunch of states are dealing with right now is plastic bags. Plastic bags were permissible in a lot of contexts, especially in grocery stores. But now they're no longer permissible because it's a law. So they're it's on both quote unquote sides of the legality. On one hand, it was legal in this context, but now it's illegal in this context. So why is it illegal? It's illegal because it is. So again, you can't appeal to the thing itself to prove it to be right, wrong, good, or bad. You have to use a bunch of different modes of knowledge. And this is kind of my point. You have to use a bunch of different modes of knowledge to come to better conclusions about settled habits of thought and action. So like for instance, like especially laws, like you can like and they're all dicey. Like again, like all of these modes of knowledge are dicey in different ways, and even the collection of those things can be dicey. So you want to be very careful about that, right? Where I think that like because of how philosophy is constructed, and this is a totally different video, but like this is why philosophy is so good and like ethics are so good and shit, because you use philosophy because philosophy by its design can tell the difference between a good convention, a bad convention, a good law and a bad law, good science, bad science, etc. And that's really important when we're having discussions. So one of the things that I was talking about the other day that sparked this video in the first place is the idea that we appeal to bad conventions, bad traditions, bad laws, and bad science to justify the harm that we do to trans people. Because again, the same bad conventions, bad traditions, bad laws, and bad science also were in the game of treating black people like dog shit. So you need modes of reference to like philosophy, for instance, to parse out like the sort of like tough questions that exist in the world. And you still can use conventions, traditions, science, and law in combination with philosophy and in combination with all these three together for other things. But one of the issues that people I think run into, and this happened on the panel itself, is that you can't appeal to itself in order to prove that something is correct or that something is incorrect or something that's good or something is bad, because the limitations of that mode of knowledge are going to keep you back from finding any level of objectivity or even anything close to like good or bad. It's very, very rough. And this happened on the panel itself. I cooked a content creator pretty badly on a very simple question, and he just kind of just started talking. And this is a good example of why there's problems with appealing to itself. In this case, an example that I'm talking about, appealing to science to prove that something is correct. Is that like what we're seeing is that there's a bit more to people's individuality and their individual expression, and the parameters that we created for those are very rigid. And even if we use the modes of knowledge that I laid out, like appealing to conventions, appealing to traditions, and appealing to science, those created a rigidness in people's own personal identification and expression. Where, for example, like you can't use any of the three I described to prove objectively that there are two genders. You can't. You can't use traditions, you can't use conventions, you can't use science.
I did. I used science. I used biological dimorphism and the sexual dichotomy. If we can agree that that science has been able to prove that there are differences between uh, biologically between females and males, then that is all the proof that we need. We can dig up any two random skeletons and still be able to determine the differences between whether or not they were male and female.
The
We
key
can look at
word,
individual species that are not human, that are not even in the animal kingdom, and still be able to determine whether they are male or female.
yes, but I'm talking about gender, not sex.
They're only two.
How do you prove that? How do you prove that there are only two genders? Don't include sex in your answer.
Sex is the only way to determine that.
Why?
Because if transgender people are transgender because they
Ignore.
are
We don't have to talk
swapping
about
one,
trans people here. You are saying that
if
you
they're
can only
swapping one
use
from the
sex to
other,
prove gender. How do you prove that? How
if
do you
they're
prove that to be
swapping one from the
objectively
other,
true?
if they're swapping one from the other, then they have to give up something in order to be one of the other parts. Now, if you're talking about gender roles, Gender roles can, I mean, washing the dishes, all that stuff. I mean, that can be anything. But if you're talking about the differences between what is a man and what is a woman, as we have determined by the science, those things all boil down to characteristics that cannot be separated from their physiology or their biology, no matter what you do.
Um, very clear. But yeah, I hope this was helpful. To kind of like conclude, conventions are collections of unreflective habits of thought and action that are passed down. Traditions are a collection of reflective habits that are of thought and action that are passed down. Science is a collection of testable habits of thought and action that are passed down. Laws are a collection of legal habits of thought and action that are passed down. All four of these things have problems. Conventions are unreliable because they are unreflective. Traditions are a little bit better than conventions because they're reflective, but they can appeal to like really poor foundations, aka dogma. Science is at the whim of the content of the analysis and the relationship between the knowledge and the object itself. And then laws are contextually specific, so something can be legal in one context, and then illegal in another. And philosophy can be used as a tool alongside these four collections of habits of thought and action to help make institutions better for people by using philosophy to parse out the good between the bad, the right between the wrong, etc. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope I didn't get too lost in the spaghetti that is my brain. Feel free to comment if you have any questions or thoughts. I try to stay within the comments within like at least a day to really as long as it is after a video is posted, just so I can hear what people are thinking about stuff. But yeah, I appreciate y'all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and take care.